the Spiridon II, have you been on this ship?
No, I don't think she's even been to Australia. She's very old, and she has some qualities about her that wouldn't allow her to trade out of Australia. Things like the head height inside the cattle decks. So I think some of the decks are 2 meters and maybe lower. We have a minimum height of 2.3 meters, and that gives us sort of some better air clearance and space for the animals. So that's one of the reasons she would never have been here. But you know, she's certainly still trading.
You have been on these ships. Can you try to make us imagine what it's like for these cows? They've been on the ship for 60 days. They were put on there in Uruguay. Can you maybe, from as far as you know from your experience, tell us from the moment they get on Uruguay till Turkey and back, what it's like for them and what their state must be by now?
Sure. So one thing to remember about these ships and this particular situation unfolding is it's a slow-moving disaster. So there's nothing happening at a real quick pace. And every day on these voyages tends to be very monotonous, and the same for the crew and the animals. The only days that really change are loading and unloading. So when the ship loaded on, I think it was the 19th of September in Uruguay, the ship would have been clean of any sewage or, you know, effluent or anything on board. They would have loaded the cattle, probably took a day to load, and then they just would have set sail. And then every day since, those animals would have been fed probably 2 times a day, maybe 6 o'clock in the morning, and then again in the mid-afternoon. The crew would have gone around and spent their time probably looking at animals, trying to see if there's any health problems that need to be addressed, any animals that aren't eating as much or animals that can't stand up. And they'll be spending a lot of time on hygiene, things like trying to clean the water troughs and or keeping water in the water troughs, because not all of these ships have automated water troughs, so they don't always fill automatically. And so a ship like the Spiridon II probably has hoses, so the crew probably have to walk around and fill these hoses manually, which is a very inefficient and high-risk way of providing water to livestock who, you know, obviously are very dependent on water. So they would have been doing that day in, day out. And from a voyage... With a voyage from Australia, every 3 to 5 days, what we do is we wash the decks with the cattle in the decks. So wash all the pen spaces and the cattle's legs, and that removes the sewage that builds up in the pens, which keeps it cleaner, reduces the heat, reduces the gas, and allows us to look at the legs for injuries, because the legs get a lot of injuries on these ships by, you know, their bony, knobbly legs, and they're lying down on this. Usually a concrete surface with no padding in between, and they get a lot of abrasions and cuts, which get really infected and can cause you know, mortalities in their own right. So the crew would have been doing this day in, day out until they got to the Mediterranean, where they're supposed to, by legislation, stop any washing and throwing bodies overboard. So any dead bodies, any cattle that died between Uruguay and, say, the Straits of Gibraltar should have been thrown overboard into the ocean before arriving into the Straits of Gibraltar, which is obviously entering the Mediterranean. Once that ship enters the Mediterranean, it's illegal for them to discharge any effluent, any sewage, any dead bodies until they leave the Mediterranean. And that's a big pollution standard held up by the International Maritime Organization. We call it MARPOL, which is short for maritime pollution. So upon arrival at Bandurma port in Turkey, that ship would have probably had maybe 7 days since going past Gibraltar of not washing, and any dead animals would have been collecting and piling up on the ship, which is why we suspect the bags on the roof. The look of them, it looked like there was some big, solid, round, heavy cargo, for want of a better word, inside those bags on the outside of the ship's decks. And it makes sense that that's what they would be, because they shouldn't have been dropping them into the ocean. They would have arrived in port. They would have tried to clean the ship as best they could, just tidy it up. But it's nearly impossible to do. With most of my voyages, we've washed the day before port, and we've often washed illegally, you know, in the Mediterranean and whatnot, to have it as clean as possible before we arrive. So it's just one of the foibles of this trade, is you often break laws to look after the animals as best as possible. And by saying that, you want the ship to look clean when the authorities come on at the end of a voyage, so they don't walk around going, oh, this is really gross. The cattle are covered in their own mess, and we don't want to discharge them for potential biosecurity or phytosanitary reasons. In this case, I don't know if they did wash before they arrived, and the ear tags may be the only discrepancy. But at the end of the voyage, we all look forward to opening the gates and unloading the cattle and getting them off the ship, because being on the ship's is not a great place for these animals to be. And this obviously hasn't happened. So the crew would just be maintaining their normal everyday routine that they've done every day from Uruguay to Turkey, in just feeding and cleaning and doing the water troughs. Very boring, but necessary.
And then it arrives in Turkey, but there it's banned and you cannot unload the animals. What happens then?
The voyages are really hard on these animals. They don't deserve to be living on concrete, and the confined environments are really hot and humid, and it's a perfect environment for bacteria and viruses to spread because animals are really closed in. Like, think about COVID when you had people on cruise ships. The virus just travelled everywhere, and cruise ships are often called petri dishes of the sea, but really live export ships are the petri dishes of the sea, because the hygiene is, by the nature of the livestock, very difficult to control. So the animals often succumb to a lot of pneumonia, which is really common. 90% of our cattle mortalities will be from pneumonia on these ships. 10% are from leg injuries that get infected and really nasty. And there's a smattering of other things in there, but they're the two big things that these animals die from. And to put them on the ship, and you've got no options. Like, you can't sort of open a gate one day and go, oh, look, we need to give them more space. You don't have the more space. You don't have more.
Yeah.
So the animals are trapped, in a horrible, unnatural situation. Inside the ships, it's a bit like, if you think of a multi-story car park, so a multi-level car park, and you drive in at the bottom, and that's what these ships look like inside. But instead of parking...
How many floors? How many floors?
Some ships I've been on have been 16. So 16, yes. So it's like a big apartment building. And a lot of the decks are under the water line, so you don't even see them all. So I think the Spiridon II has 7 decks. So I think you can see 3 from outside. And and they'll be down below in the water. So,
but they don't see any light neither, these animals, at the below. There's no sunlight, natural sunlight.
No natural light at all, but they will have 24/7 artificial light, which is actually considered a form of torture by the Geneva Conventions. So do with that what you wish. They've also got a lot of noise that they're exposed to from the fans, because a lot of people misunderstand that these ships have a ventilation system that cools them. They don't. They don't have air conditioning as we know it. They have a ventilation system that pumps in just the normal air from the outside. So if it's hot outside, hot air comes in. If it's cold outside, cold air comes in. So it's not a controlled environment. But the cattle themselves give off a lot of body heat through their crowded condition, through the fermenting sewage on the ground, and that makes the pens and the decks, especially down below, a lot warmer than they would normally be.
But then, so going from Uruguay to Turkey, so far that part is legal. It's part of it's a trade. We've looked into this. It's legal. There's no laws broken. But at the moment, you said when you enter the Strait of Gibraltar, you cannot dump anything anymore in the Mediterranean Sea. So you go to Turkey. They're stuck there now for 2 weeks extra. You cannot dump any waste. So how long does POW, like, what is if after 3 days, what does it look like if you don't clean? And after now, I think almost 30 days now, 2 weeks, no, 3 weeks now, yeah.
Yeah, 3 or 4 weeks. Look, the animals would be covered in sewage, so they'd just look like, the ice creams you get at the movies, they dip them in the chocolate. They will look like that, but it's going to be all sewage, especially around their bellies and their legs, anywhere they lie down on the surface, on the floor. And often with these ships, and we suspect this ship has maximum loading density, so they put as many cattle on to make it cost effective as possible, which is what business does, and it's not cool at all. So what normally happens with maximum loading is that the animals can't all lie down at the same time. So one animal will have to sort of stand across the, one will be lying down and the other one will stand over the top of it, and they'll swap over during the day and, whatever they need to do, which means any sewage on the bottom of one animal will then be rubbed onto the otherwise clean top of the one lying down. So it just ends up everywhere. And the cattle don't like it. We see pictures of livestock with feces all over them commonly, like, pigs and especially cattle. But given the choice, these animals will actually avoid getting dirty and they'll clean themselves. So the fact that they're in that situation, it's like you and I, this isn't a situation we would choose to be in. We wouldn't naturally go and lie in our own waste given the choice. So it's just because these animals are just stuck in this very small place without a toilet. No one's wiping them up. So, yeah, they're just a mess.
It's an unimaginable mess. Like, you're describing this, and they are, especially the cows at the bottom of the lowest deck, the lower 4 decks, they haven't seen any sunlight for now 60 days. They're for 4 weeks of those 60 days, or like 30 days of the 60, they're covered in their own waste by now. And they're still, while we're having this discussion, this talk, they're still there. But where does it become illegal?
Well, I don't know if it does, because there's such weak legislation about how we treat animals. And if you look at some of the international standards for loading livestock through, say, the World Organization of Animal Health, I've gone through those papers quite a bit, and it says they're supposed to be provided with the 5 freedoms: the ability to walk around and move and stretch and behave normally and be clean. They're supposed to have somewhere clean to lie down. But for as long as I've been aware, these ships have continued to trade, and those standards have not been ever upheld. And I've written to they used to be called the OIE. I wrote to them and complained many times about the fact that, their standards are not good enough. We need to do better by these animals. And there's a little crossover between what's considered transport and what's considered housing. So they often, you'll hear feedback like, oh yeah, but it's just transport. So, at the end of that, they go back to how they should be being kept. But that's rubbish, because you can't have a floating feedlot, which is what these things are. You can't have a floating feedlot, A, starving animals, if that's what's happening, and B, you can't not consider it housing. It's not transport. It's not a truck driving for 8 hours. It's a ship that's going for weeks and potentially months. So that's accommodation. That's not, a quick trip. So that distinction needs to be made and written into law, that I would say anything that involves where an animal needs to be regularly fed and watered inside the confines of that environment is considered housing. So that would strengthen the quality of what the World Organization of Animal Health regulations say should happen. But again, you look at intensive dairies that are inside and intensive piggeries and whatnot, and they're often deplorable. So, some of them look quite like a live export ship, except for they're not moving around. The other thing is, the live export ships are moving with the water if the water's rough. So that's harder on the animals again.
That makes this story. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and who said, like, yeah, but 1.5 million. I live in the Netherlands, so 1.5 million animals are killed here daily, and that is absolutely true. And there's horrible things happening in farming here in the Netherlands also. Just this specific case about this ship, this suffering.
And it's completely unnecessary. It's a form of torture that we're putting them through before we can eat them or use them for milk. And there's alternatives. That's the thing. We could slaughter them in the countries that they come from for slaughter animals and send that meat by refrigerated or frozen, chilled and frozen means of transport. For dairy cattle, we can send semen and embryos by air. So the animals themselves, as full functioning sentient animals, don't have to experience this. They can just go on a quick flight, maybe 24 hours in the air, including stops, and then, they get turned into an animal at arrival into another country. They don't have to endure this open-ended risk that they're in, because when you leave a port, you never know what seas you're going to go through. You can hope it's going to be smooth, and you can think this isn't cyclone season, or if it is, you think, great, I hope we don't run into a cyclone. But with voyages this long, you can't usually predict the weather that far in advance to protect yourself. And the one thing that is working in this voyage's favour at the moment is the fact that it's not summer. So if it was summer, they'd be having a lot more difficulty with heat stress. They would probably be having a lot more abortions with the cattle, a lot more respiratory diseases. They certainly would have had a lot more deaths. And yeah, that's a small mercy that these animals are experiencing at the moment.
And just asking about the pregnant cow. Half of those cows, because we didn't talk about it yet, half of those cows are pregnant. As a veterinarian, again, and I know a cow is pregnant for 9 months. So how many months they would have been when they when they were boarded in Uruguay?
So what are they, 60 days into the voyage now? So they would have been 7 months. Well, again, this is where regulation's required. So in Australia, we're not supposed to send them in their last trimester. So they have to be under 6 months or under. That has to be the maximum gestation period that they can be in when they leave the voyage. But, we talk about veterinary science being an exact science, but we see a lot of times when, there's a lot of wiggle room. So pregnancy testing these animals isn't done the same way generally as with a human. So it's not done with ultrasound. It's done with manual palpation. A veterinarian will use their arm. And so, you can easily be out by a couple of weeks. Now, that's a couple of weeks. The voyage can be delayed by a couple of weeks, and then maybe unloading can be delayed by a couple of weeks. And so all those weeks sort of add up, and it could be a month here or there. So, deliveries could come a couple of weeks early. So it's not uncommon for these pregnant animals to have calves on the voyages. I've arrived in Turkey in the past. I had 22 live calves that I was trying to manage. And fortunately, we stopped at 2 ports. The first port wanted, I think we had sheep on board. We unloaded the sheep. And that meant that sheep are much cleaner with their pens. Their sewage is drier. So I managed to be able to use the then empty sheep pens, and I moved the mothers and the babies up into that area and made a nursery there. So they had a lot more space. They were still lying on sewage, but it was dry, and that probably helped us. But they shouldn't have been born on the voyage. That was too many things, falling through gaps. So yeah, look, pregnant animals, no animal deserves to be at sea. The trade should just not exist. It's ridiculous. It made sense maybe 50 years ago when we didn't have good refrigerating transport schemes. Like back then, it was probably seen as really clever. And now we know better. And now we know what the conditions are like on the ships as well. So that was hidden for a very long time. So no animal should be on the ship, especially the more vulnerable animals like the pregnant ones, and especially the babies. To have to try and survive in that filthy environment under all the stress, like just the physiological stress of the movement, they can't rest, the noise of the ventilation machines, the 24/7 light, the heat that they're experiencing, and the crowding where other animals are, potentially stepping on them and squishing them into the ground. So it's really hard on them. And it's also really hard on the crew. A lot of people used to think, the crew are all villains, and if you go to sea, you're a villain. But that's a bit like saying, the policemen and your emergency doctors are all villains because, they help somebody out of a car crash or they help somebody with a drug overdose. They don't cause that problem. They're there to address it as, to do the best they can for that victim. And so that's what these crews are like. And they're often paid really poorly, and they're working really horrible jobs. Like they do on average a 12-hour day, and you'll often have to dismember these bodies and carry bits and pieces off to the top to throw them away just because they're really heavy. Sometimes you're lucky you can get a crane in. but yeah, they're going to be having a really horrible time now as well, and they don't know when they're going to get home. They won't have had 10 minutes off the ship since leaving Uruguay.
No, we heard also that you just said also sending refrigerated meat or cold meat. This is way cheaper apparently to do it in this way than to invest in the logistics of transporting meat, which is quite shocking. The exporter, I think his name is Fernando Fernandez of Gano's on Livestock. He was interviewed. Usually you don't find anything about the exporter, but he was a week after the ship left. He was interviewed in 2 business podcasts on how proud he was that Turkey was accepting pregnant cows again, because Turkey had banned it for a while and now it was accepted, and what great business it is. But this is also, like you said, like basically he wants to, you gather all these animals from Uruguay, so the farmers there get some money. I think it's around $800 per cow that goes on there, and then you get a crew, and those are not the best paid crew.
Look, like I say, the trade probably made sense years ago. I think now it's entirely replaceable. I think we're going to put up with it. I think we're going to see it until such times as their ships basically disappear. And the fleet that we have around the world, there's only about 110 of these ships, which seems like a lot, but it's really not. And they're disappearing pretty quickly. They're getting really old and they're falling apart and they're becoming less reliable and more expensive to maintain. So as this happens, people are retiring these ships. Now, in every other shipping sector, so if you're talking oil tankers, cargo ships, container ships, these ships are normally retired about 25 years old. Yeah. So this ship's already, double its work span. And it would never be allowed in Australia, I don't think. They would just be terrified that it was going to fall apart. And so what I predict is going to happen is that standards will slowly increase around the world the more times this kind of rubbish happens, and it'll make it more difficult for the worst ships, and we'll just get less and less ships. The more people know about this trade, the less likely it is that people will invest in it, because the more pressure there is to get rid of it, which is just growing every day. And interviews like this are amazing to spread the information to people who might not have been across it or might not have realised how bad it is. It's sold to a lot of agricultural areas as, this is a fantastic option. You can get more money if there's more competition in the market between the slaughterhouse and the exporters. But at the end of the day, what generally happens is something in export goes wrong and people get really embarrassed or ashamed or defensive. And in areas where export has been stopped, you get these farmers now coming out going, oh, we're so glad it's not here now, because it was a horrible temptation, because we might have got an extra few dollars per animal, but then we just spent our time hoping that nothing went wrong and it didn't end up, in the news as some massive disaster. So we're going to see the end of it. I haven't seen a new ship built since 2017. So, that's 9 years ago. So 8 years ago, nearly 9 years ago. So that's really encouraging. The insurance companies don't want to touch them because of the high risk that they involve. So I think we're just going to see the end of this lot. They're just basically going to be used up. And see, unless the people who own them can get good money for scrap metal and send them off to the scrap yards in, wherever, they will just keep operating them until such times as they fail or the trade ends. And unfortunately, the average age of the fleet around the world is 40 years old. So that tells me that a lot of these ships are at the end of their life, and we're going to see the end of them pretty soon, I hope. I think there'll be very little, if any, trade going in, say, 10 years.
To go back to the Spiridon, so those animals have now been 60 days at sea. They're now passing Italian waters. There is a lot of pressure. I think Animal Welfare Foundation, we put up some templates which are being sent a lot. The European Commission, the EU, they're seeing this, right? So by now, this is an animal welfare crisis. And of course, everybody says, it's not my fault. It's Uruguay, it's Turkey. They should have done it. It's a trade, of course. But still, all of us are seeing this happening in front of our eyes. We're all European citizens. We're all saying, but what's happening? Why is this happening? Yep. So it somewhere becomes also an obligation. And they might dump these animals. They will not. They might not in the Mediterranean Sea or not. So that becomes a biosecurity risk. So when does it become, 2 questions. when do you think, I don't know if you can answer this question, but when do you think other countries should just step in, even though they're not part of the trade? And second question, how long can these animals, if there's no confirmation yet that they picked up food, but they picked up some food on Saturday 8th November in Turkey, that's the last known place they picked up food. How much do you pick up? Is that enough? Do you have any side on that?
I saw some footage and I've seen photographs of the fodder that was put onto the ship. And from what I can gather, unless they put a whole heap of bags of stuff somewhere else that we didn't see, it looks like they've really just loaded hay, which is not a high nutrient fodder for these cattle. And these cattle on board, I don't know the weights of them. The pregnant cattle that have had their babies, they're probably, you know, close to the 400 kilo mark. And there may be smaller ones on board as well. But generally, those animals need about 2.5% of their body weight every day in food just to sort of maintain their weight. So ideally, they would want more. So that sort of works out. Rough calculations would be maybe 27 metric tonne a day for these animals to be fed. So by looking at the stack of hay on the roof, I don't believe that, plus the time that they had in port, allowed them to load anything significant, especially not significantly enough to get them all the way back to Uruguay. So my hope is that somebody will open their doors, maybe Spain or Portugal, countries that already have an export trade, because it means that they already have the type of food that these ships require, because you can't just feed anything on these things, and you can't change the animal's diet really quickly, because that can make their intestines upset as well. So hopefully Spain or Portugal will be able to allow them to come in and get some more food, enough to, if they are going back to Uruguay, you know, I'm not sure if they've just put that on their tracking system just to keep people off their back. But it's hard to do that and then not supply food. We know the animals need the food. So yeah, hopefully they can get food from somewhere if they are going to go to Uruguay. If they don't stop anywhere and they head out into the Atlantic Ocean, several scenarios, they're either going to end up in Uruguay with very few cattle who are alive. They'll have gone without food and succumb to diseases, starvation, whatever that lack of nutrition entails for them. The other scenarios are that these animals will be euthanized on the ship and thrown into the ocean. So that would be a pretty sad thing to do, and super wasteful for these animals to have spent, you know, the last 2.5 months of their life being, you know, traumatized and tortured on these vessels, crammed into a horrible space, like a really crowded hot elevator with people you don't know, and everyone's going to the toilet around you, and it's boring because you can't look out, and you're depressed and pretty fed up. So yeah, that's a scenario, that they all get killed and thrown overboard. And there is one other extreme scenario, and that is that it's difficult to get 3,000 bodies off a ship. And this ship's already 52 years old, which means, you know, to most sensible people, this ship should be retired. So they could all be killed on this ship and the ship sunk.
That isn't...
Ships do get sunk. You know, ships that have a problem and can't be moved somewhere, they get taken out to deep water and sunk. So if all the animals are on it dead, preferably, and it gets sunk, then again, I don't know if that's an illegal thing, because the other thing is fuel. How much fuel has this ship got on it? Because it's unlikely to... they stopped at Cape Verde on the way over from Uruguay. So I suspect that's a common bunkering spot. We call refueling a ship bunkering. So it's likely that they stopped there and got fuel. I don't know if they went alongside the actual wharf. Often the little fuel ships come out alongside and they park next to it and pump fuel in. So I suspect if they're going to try and go back to Uruguay and they don't stop in another port for food, if they stop for food, they can usually get fuel in those ports as well. But if they go straight to Cape Verde for fuel, then things are looking grim. And if they sink the ship, they won't want much fuel on board because that's an environmental pollution that can be avoided. I don't think they get fined for ships actually sinking if it's in deep water that doesn't cause a maritime risk. So, you know, the ship goes way down. You know, a lot of the really deep ocean, it's 5 kilometres deep. So if you sink a ship there, you're never going to see it again. And no one's going to hit it.
But if you say kill the animals, but do they have the equipment to kill animals? And there's no veterinarian on board.
Well, that's a good question. I thought Uruguay did put veterinarians on board, but I could be wrong. I think they've had them on in the past. The ships that I was on used to all carry what we call a captive bolt. They're like the bolt guns that they use in slaughterhouses. So there's not a bullet that goes free flying. It's just a bolt that jumps in and out of the head and kills them. So there's every likelihood that there's one of those on board. Now, do they have 3,000 caps? Caps are the little charges that we put inside to make the bolt fire. That would be a big question. They're not hard to get hold of. So that's something that could be brought out to the ship. And even if they went to Cape Verde for fuel, that could be, you know, somebody could bring a little box of those out to them and they could do what they have to do. Horrible for the cattle.
But
be good for the first one, but all the ones watching afterwards would be pretty awful.
But you know this better than I. I was having this thought on Sunday because I heard that they might kill the animals on board, and then I thought, what's worse, to starve to death or to be shot? Which is, of course, a choice that it's neither.
Starving to death would take a long time. It would take, you know, probably 3 weeks. So if they kept going now and they didn't feed, but there was still water available, the animals, a lot of them might be alive, but maybe not upright by the time they got to Uruguay. But because of the way these animals digest food, it would mean that their intestines would be basically wrecked and they would never be able to be recovered. So you're basically killing them. It would be very hard to return that, and there wouldn't be many animals left after this bit of food runs out. Yeah, I would rather get shot than that. But you know, one of the concerns then is every animal's going to watch it. So you know, it's not going to be that easy to put up a shield so that they don't see. Like in abattoirs, we try to do it so that an animal walks into a private area, gets shot, disappears, the next one walks in, doesn't see the dead one in front of it. Yeah, this would be a much messier scenario and take a long time.
And if there's no veterinarian, I can't confirm that there's a veterinarian. I thought Animal Welfare Foundation, but I'm not sure, hasn't mentioned a veterinarian on board.
We don't know.
No.
Yeah.
But then if there's not a veterinarian on board, then you don't have skilled people to do this.
It doesn't mean they can't do it. So okay. I've known a lot of stockmen who are probably better with the gun than some of the vets I know, because not every vet uses a gun. So, you know, we're not really trained to kill. We're trained to try and keep them alive. So a lot of the stockmen that come from farms are often better skilled at maintaining the guns and also using them. So, so they can be really useful too if they know what they're doing.
Okay, so that would be an option that is a realistic option then. If there's somebody on board who can kill the animals, then they just need to, and then sink the ship, and then.
If you think about the El Beek and the Karim Allah?
Yeah.
So, you know, they were floating around trying to find someone to take them, and the animals were all slaughtered on the port. So it's not really much different to that. It would be, except for they would just not get off the ship. It would just be, you know, not quite walking the plank, but you would try to get them as close to the edge as you could so that the removal of them was less onerous on the crew. And then, you know, maybe if you knocked off the top deck, you'd move the next ones up to that. They could walk up and, yeah. And it's a nasty, really depressing thing for the crew. I've spoken with the International Transport Workers Federation and ask that they try to check with the crew and see what's going on, because my experience has been that the crew are lovely people. They don't want to see the animals suffer. They're not monsters, and they especially find it hard when there's babies involved and the newborns and whatnot, because most of them are family people and they're missing their families who are at home, and they would like to be at home with them and in a scenario that's not like this. And so, yeah, they find that really hard, which is understandable. It's awful killing baby animals. So, and seeing them die and suffer. So, yeah, it's all can be avoided by not putting them on ships.
That's the only, but to think of a solution in this case, it seems almost like there is no.
Yeah, well, another option would be that Uruguay or any country that wants to help could, send a little boatload of extra people out to help with a few more guns and all the caps involved. And, you don't have to go far off the shore into the Atlantic to find a place that's, far enough away that it's legal to drop these bodies, and deep enough and get out of the way of the normal shipping channels. And you could have, a team of people go out and just do a mass slaughter. And that would be a lot quicker. And they would help with the disposal as well, using the cranes and dragging them to the edge, whatever needs to happen. That would certainly be a sensible option and probably the most cost effective. If they're going to write off the cargo as dead and not feed them, I mean, hopefully they'll feed them and they'll get them off in Uruguay, and people will go, let's not do that again. That was stupid. But yeah, there are options, but they're not very nice. So
there's no scenario in this whole story where it's a happy ending, right? There's no scenario in which calves are going to get off this boat and they're gonna get we've been talking now for 45 minutes, and the ending is what is the best way to kill them, which I think by now I'm not a veterinarian at all, but what you describe, I have a cat. If my cat is suffering, we would euthanize her if she's suffering. So if these animals are suffering, euthanizing them it's the best. And then it now comes to how do you kill them in the most humane way possible towards a cow. So clearing up a space where they don't see each other, doing it one by one.
Yeah, and let's not kid ourselves. Just because they're dairy cattle doesn't mean that they weren't going to be killed. So people are often, slaughter cattle, they're just going to get killed and eaten anyway. But dairy cattle are going to get killed and eaten eventually as well. So I often think that dairy cattle have a worse life, because not only do they get, born, raised, transported somewhere by a horrible ship, moved to a country they don't know and aren't of the same climate for. So going to a cold Turkey after growing up in, humid Uruguay, that's hard on them. But they're not just going to get slaughtered. They're going to have babies for 3 or 5 years, and then they're usually metabolically worn out, and their babies are taken away from them. And, we know scientifically that these animals grieve those babies being taken, and then they're going to be killed and turned into hamburger mince anyway. So, it's just awful that these animals have had to go through this experience before they get killed. The whole breeding of these animals ends up in death. And, the best case scenario is they have as good a life as possible before that happens. And this is certainly being denied to these animals. So it's...
And if people listening, and I see a lot of outrage about this, I guess then the main solution would also be to just look at yourself, but to see how not to say you have to go vegan or plant-based or whatever, but maybe look at your meat consumption a bit better. Like, where does your meat come from? How has it been treated well? Was it raised in the country you live in, so it hasn't been transported? Maybe look at the way you consume foods a bit.
Totally. I always recommend to people, I get challenged quite a lot. I'm not vegan, but I am very specific about what I do eat. And I eat very little meat, but what I do eat, I choose to be from as high a welfare standard as I can find. So, there's some practices I won't buy animals from. Like, when I was working in the Middle East, for example, I wouldn't eat red meat because I didn't know where it came from.
Yeah.
You know, I'm like, did it come off a ship? I don't want to eat anything off a ship, because not only has the animal suffered, the quality of the meat's generally very low, because the stress and the disease these animals have been exposed to mean that the meat itself is actually a high stressed meat, and it's not a great product for people who like meat and go, oh, this is nice, this is chewy. Well, the chewy one, the tough, horrible chewy one, might have just come off a ship, and you know, they may have just cut a big infected part of the body away, and they're providing you what looks clean. So yeah, look, I certainly won't eat the meat that I suspect may have come from the live export chain, and I recommend others to make their own decisions on that, but I don't think it's the healthier choice.
No. So that's a good for these animals. It's hopefully they get euthanized as fast as possible in a way that's as humane as possible. And for people who are outraged by this, is to look at your meat consumption, look at the way where you consume your meat from.
Yeah, and speak to your politicians and your people in authority in your countries to say, are we complicit in this? Are we importing these animals or exporting these animals? Do the authorities really know what these animals go through? Because a lot of people are so removed from where their food comes from, let alone the middle of the ocean. When I first joined the ship in 2001, when I came home and told people what I was doing, they're just like, we do what? Why are animals like, was this just like one special trip? And I'm like, no, this is an industry that just goes back and forth. And I always say to people, we can export well, but we can't do it financially viably. So it has to be done horribly. And by horribly, I mean, mass density of animals, not air conditioned. There's a whole lot of reasons why we can't do that safely anyway. But yeah, they don't get the first class treatment of, say, a racehorse that comes from England to America or Australia for a big fancy race. They don't get the treatment that a zoo animal gets, for example, if there's an endangered rhino going from South Africa to Germany. Because people go, oh, we move animals all the time. Not like this, we don't.
But it's very hidden. I didn't know until I started writing about it, and I was completely shocked. And even this case with pregnant cows, for me, was new that they transport pregnant cows. I didn't even know that was an option. One of the things the exporter also said is that Turkey is such a huge, the exporter from Uruguay, is that Turkey is such a huge market because of tourism. And then if you look into tourism in Turkey, you have all those all-inclusive hotels, and like our consumption has gone up of dairy and meat has gone out the roof. I don't know how you say this, but it's extreme how big our consumption is. Through the roof. Thank you. But it's our consumption is
Yeah. That doesn't mean the only answer is to bring it in live.
No.
Like I say, we can put embryos, places like Uruguay, any country with a dairy industry can develop its own embryos and sperm of, they only order those products when they want fresh genetics to come in with a different quality, like they might make more meat, or they might yield more milk per year. And those, what we call them, biologicals, so those biological products, which are still baby cows, but they're not really yet, they can be frozen in dry ice and put into the equivalent of a big canister, and like a big thermos, but a cold one, screw the top, put it on an aeroplane, fly it over, and that semen and all those embryos can be implanted in cattle that already exist. And then you extend your herd that way with those better genetics.
And what you said, sending embryos, is something I'm going to look into also and write more about it, because maybe it's the same as people don't know about that live animal export is happening. I think maybe even not enough people know that this is an option they could do. And maybe for an export in Uruguay, it's like, oh my God, this also exists. Maybe we should invest in this, and maybe for Turkey also. And at the same time, while you're talking, I also think people really need to look at their meat consumption, because I think we can go as far. And I mean, I hope cloned meat will become a huge thing one day. And then I understand people have a hard time letting go of meat or eating less of it, and at the same time it's also something you can do so immediate, kind of like if you want to in many ways help out the world. It's a small, not to fully end it, but just a little bit more conscious about it.
Yeah, look, you really can be. And, there's some really great alternative products out there. So, for those of us who really like that, what do they call it? Umami flavor. So,
Yeah.
there's salty, sweet, umami, like that savory flavor. I like that savory flavor.
Yeah.
But I don't want to look at my plate and think, oh, I wonder what kind of a life that had before, tonight.
Yeah.
But there's some really great alternatives that, I've only found recently through friends. Like I say, I'm not vegan, but if I can reduce my consumption and I find a good alternative. So I personally can't eat dairy food. It just doesn't agree with me. But there are great dairy alternatives and I like them. And now I've got to the point that if ever I go somewhere and I don't have a choice and somebody gives me cow's milk in a coffee, I don't like it. Whereas 15 years ago, I liked it, but now I don't. So
it's exactly the same, yeah. And it's also so I grew up in, like, I'm Surinamese, which is a South American country. I grew up eating a lot of meat. I never even in my culture also, my parents ate a lot of meat. I never thought about where do animals come from, and now once you start learning it a bit, and then you're like, it's not that I always tell people, it's not that I used to love Big Macs, like I was a huge fan of Big Macs, and that I don't think the taste is bad or anything. It's just that I don't want to be part of suffering, and that's the only thing. It's not it tastes great, yeah, but it's just I don't want to be knowing it. And of course I write so much about it, so if you don't knowing it becomes more and more difficult. Yeah, it's not
and it's a bigger issue too. It's a health issue. It's also an environmental issue. So I think as a collective thing that we do for the world we live in, and for ourselves, psychologically and physiologically, avoiding a lot of the products that we've had pushed upon us as kids. I grew up eating meat every meal, and mind you, my parents were Scottish, so I'm not sure what it actually was, because there's a reason you don't see Scottish restaurants. The food was horrible, but that could have just been my mum's cooking. But yeah, it's something we don't need, and again, I'm not vegan, but I always find myself in these funny little arguments with people going, oh, but if you eat a vegan diet, you're weak and you can't lift stuff, and I I point out all the famous sports people and gorillas and cattle that are vegan, and I'm like, they're pretty I wouldn't take on most of the cows, so they're pretty tough vegans. So yeah, I think we've just got to think about it differently, and different markets have to be a little bit less defensive. And a lot of people are worried their livelihoods are going to go down the drain, but I think the newer generations coming through are transitioning into more diverse farming portfolios, so they're less reliant and less terrified of change.
I've written about the Karim Allah and Al Baik. It was 4 years ago. It didn't get the response as this is getting, because it was still Spain, Turkey. It was still, but now people are actually realizing there are calves on board. I keep citing the same numbers from the last veterinary check, but I think there more calves must have been born by now. And
I'm sure more cattle would have died.
Yeah,
because
and more.
The cattle don't get to a point where they go, oh, look, I'm fine now.
No.
We're all good. Usually in these situations, disease just gets more and more prevalent. Animals get more weak and then more susceptible to any disease that's going through the ship. So the mortalities tend to rise as the voyage progresses. So we're on day 60 now. It's not getting better for anyone.
It's hard to let go of this case, knowing that they're there. The lowest deck, you can't even. If I think about those animals at the lowest deck, it's
the worst deck. It's the deck that is normally the soggiest and the grossest, and the air is most stale, and the gases are higher. And I just think the cattle are more depressed. They're often smaller decks because the ships get narrow both ways, and they're often near an engine room as well. So when the engine's running, the cattle will be on a different side of the wall, and this side will be hot from the engine, and so there's extra heat coming in. and noise. And yeah, it just all adds up to being a pretty awful story. And I think the thing with the ships is it really is an outdated practice, like slavery. And
Yeah.
the world is coming to its senses, but while there's a few people still making money out of it, that will happen until such times as they can't, which will be
Yeah.
regulations getting too tight or not enough ships left. So it's a winnable war. Yeah, it took a while to get my head around the fact that this trade actually was a bit of a had a bit of a mask on. Like, it just looked like this big, powerful, financially viable thing, but in fact it's actually terribly fragile and vulnerable. And we just have to keep pointing out to the world that it is not a reliable trade. It is high risk, and people will lose money and animals will suffer constantly. So we need to find a better solution for everyone, and more. We already have them. We just need to veer more towards those ones and get rid of this one. So yeah, just replace it.